In the 13th century, the lands of East and Southeast Asia trembled under the thunder of conquest. From the frozen plains of Mongolia to the lush deltas of the Red River in northern Vietnam, two worlds were about to collide. The rising empire of Đại Việt under the Trần dynasty, and the relentless expansion of the Mongol world power that had swept across Eurasia like a storm. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test the will of a small but defiant nation. The Trần dynasty, ruling from the early years of the century, had built a realm both resilient and ambitious. Their capital, Thăng Long, now known as Hanoi, stood amid fertile river plains and intricate waterways that connected villages, rice fields, and fortresses. Unlike the nomadic Mongols who ruled by speed and terror, the Trần rulers governed through kinship, Confucian ideals, and a deep connection to the land. The Vietnamese people, descendants of centuries of struggle against Chinese domination, had learned that survival depended on unity and the cunning use of their terrain. Beyond the northern border, the world was shifting in ways that would soon reach the gates of Thăng Long. The Mongol Empire, forged by Genghis Khan and expanded by his successors, had already conquered northern China, Central Asia, and much of the Middle East. In the year 1271, after years of campaigning, Kublai Khan declared the Yuan dynasty in China, turning his gaze toward the south. From the steppes of Mongolia to the palaces of Beijing, his empire stretched across the continent like a sea of banners, and his ambition seemed limitless. Yet even for an empire so vast, the humid forests and waterways of Southeast Asia presented a new and unpredictable frontier. At that time, Đại Vit's geopolitical position was precarious. To the north lay Yunnan and Guangxi, modern southwestern China, territories that had fallen under Mongol rule after their defeat of the southern Song. To the south stretched Champa, another small kingdom along the central coast of modern Vietnam, often both rival and ally. Đại Vit's mountains shielded it from invasion routes, yet those same passes also led directly into the Red River Delta, the heart of the kingdom. Any army that entered from Yunnan could threaten the very core of Trần authority. For decades, the Vietnamese had balanced diplomacy and defiance in their relations with their northern neighbors. The Trần court maintained a tributary relationship with the Chinese dynasties, sending envoys and gifts to affirm peace while quietly safeguarding its independence. This ancient ritual of tribute was less a symbol of submission than of careful diplomacy, a way for small states to survive between giants. As the Song dynasty fell and the Yuan rose in its place, the Trần rulers extended the same courtesy to Kublai Khan, but the Mongols understood such gestures differently. To them, tribute implied total submission. Historical records from warhistory.org and the official Yuan annals describe the early exchanges between Đại Việt and the Mongols as polite but tense. Envoys carried imperial letters demanding passage for Mongol troops through Vietnamese territory, ostensibly to attack the remnants of the southern Song in Guangxi. Yet behind these requests lay a larger ambition: control over trade routes and political supremacy. The Trần court, suspicious of Mongol intentions, delayed and avoided a clear answer. Every scribe and scholar in the royal audience chamber understood the danger. Granting passage would allow foreign troops deep into the heart of the kingdom. Refusing risked war with the most powerful army the world had ever known. Within the royal citadel of Thăng Long, preparations began quietly. The Vietnamese military system was small in number, compared with the legions of the Mongols, but it possessed qualities that would later prove decisive: flexibility, mobility, and an understanding of the land. The kingdom's defense relied on a combination of local militias and professional troops known as Quan Cam Ve. Each province maintained its own forces that could be summoned by royal decree. On the plains and river deltas, elephants stood as living fortresses, their tusks bound with bronze and their backs carrying towers of archers. The sight of them inspired awe among allies and fear among enemies. Along the waterways, the Trần navy, sleek wooden vessels armed with crossbows and fire, guarded the Red River and its tributaries. Despite its modest size, Đại Vit's military strength lay not in numbers but in unity. The Trần family had established a system in which members of the royal house served both as kings and generals. Loyalty was personal, and command was centralized. From the villages came men hardened by rice farming and floods. men who knew the rivers as intimately as soldiers of other lands knew their deserts. Each hilltop fortress, each watchtower by the river was part of an invisible net that would later close around invaders. While Defied prepared quietly, the Mongol court grew impatient. Having subdued the southern Song in 1279, Kublai Khan now sought to secure the entire coastline of East Asia. Control of the seas meant control of trade, from the South China Sea to the Indian Ocean. To complete that vision, the Yuan dynasty needed to bring the southern kingdoms to heel: Burma, Champa, and Defied. The imperial strategy was clear: expansion southward to ensure that no rival power could challenge the Yuan's maritime ambitions. From Beijing, Kublai Khan dispatched envoys to Defied, demanding submission and logistical support for campaigns into the southern seas. The demands included supplies of rice, laborers, and guides through the dense jungles. To the Mongols, these requests were routine. To the Vietnamese, they were insults cloaked in ceremony. According to the chronicles summarized on facts and details, the Trun court hesitated but ultimately refused the most extreme demands. The decision, though cautious in tone, was an unmistakable act of defiance. In the candle-lit halls of Tanglong, ministers debated the meaning of survival. Some urged diplomacy, better to yield a little than to invite destruction. Others, including the younger princes who would later become heroes, argued that yielding once would mean yielding forever. The ruler, Trun Taitung, listened in silence as the council's voices rose and fell. Outside the palace walls, the sounds of drums echoed from the training grounds, where soldiers drilled beneath banners bearing the symbol of the dragon, a creature of both water and sky, emblem of their dual strength. Across the border in Yunnan, modern southwestern China, Mongol commanders began to move. Scouts returned with reports of the delta's geography, its rivers and mountain passes. The first sparks of conflict had already been struck. Kublai's generals understood that any invasion of Defied would require careful coordination. Armies marching through jungles, supply trains crossing narrow passes, fleets navigating monsoon seas. Yet confidence reigned supreme in the Mongol ranks. They had conquered larger empires and defeated mightier foes. What resistance could a small kingdom offer? The Vietnamese understood that question better than their enemies. History had taught them that the measure of a nation was not its size, but its endurance. The memory of past struggles against northern domination ran deep, from the battles of Ngo Quyen on the Bac Dang River, now in Quang Ninh province, in the 10th century, to the victories that founded the Li and Trun dynasties. Every scholar, every soldier, and every farmer carried within them a quiet knowledge that the land itself could become a weapon. Rivers could be traps, forests could be shields, and time could be an ally. Thus, as the 13th century approached its middle years, the two worlds stood on opposite sides of a narrow frontier. On one side, the empire of the horse and bow, an army accustomed to the vast openness of the steppe. On the other, a nation of rivers and paddies, where resistance was woven into daily life. The emissaries had spoken, the letters had been written, and diplomacy had failed. The first embers of war began to glow. In the villages near the border, peasants whispered of strange riders seen on mountain trails. Merchants from the north reported that supply lines were forming along the passes of Van Nam. Within the royal capital, the Trun king ordered new fortifications built along the Red River. The smell of resin from freshly cut timber filled the air. That night, as chroniclers would later record, the moon rose over Tanglong, casting its light across the ramparts and the slow, dark waters below. In that pale glow, Defied seemed small, a narrow ribbon of land between mountains and sea. Yet in the heart of its people burned a conviction stronger than any empire's decree, that this land was their own, and that no power, however vast, could take it without paying a terrible price. The Mongols had crossed continents to reach this frontier, believing they could conquer as easily as they had elsewhere. They did not yet know that the jungles and rivers of Defied would become their undoing, that a nation of farmers and poets would teach them the meaning of endurance. The fire had been lit, faint at first, but destined to blaze across the decades to come, illuminating one of the most extraordinary struggles of the medieval world. And so began the story of how a small kingdom, standing between two empires, dared to defy the greatest military machine in history, and against all odds, survived. The first flame had been lit, and it now flickered dangerously along the northern frontier of David. The season was turning cool when the riders from the Yuan arrived. Stern men wrapped in fur-lined cloaks, their horses breathing steam in the humid air of the borderlands. They carried scrolls sealed with the imperial mark of Kublai Khan, demanding what no sovereign nation could willingly accept: free passage for Mongol troops through David to strike the last remnants of the southern Song. To the Mongols, it was a mere matter of logistics. To the Trun court, it was an open invitation to occupation. The envoys entered Thonglong, modern Hanoi, under the strictest supervision. The capital, with its tiled roofs and flickering oil lamps, watched them as one might watch a storm building on the horizon. At the royal palace, courtiers whispered behind their sleeves. They remembered what the Mongols had done to other kingdoms, how the Jin had been annihilated, how Baghdad had burned, how entire cities had been erased. The court scribes laid out the Mongol letter on a jade table. Its words, translated aloud by trembling interpreters, were firm. The Khan required cooperation, supplies, and obedience. The Trun Emperor, Trun Taitung, listened in silence. Then, as was his custom, he ordered that the council convene at dusk. When the court assembled, the great bronze gong rang once, echoing down the marble corridors. Ministers filed in beneath banners embroidered with dragons. Outside, the wind rustled through the courtyards. No one spoke at first. The king's younger brother, a man known for both intellect and caution, suggested appeasement. Allow the Mongols passage, he said, and avoid the ruin of the kingdom. Others disagreed sharply. General Trun Thudo, the iron-willed uncle of the king, declared that no foreign army should ever tread the soil of David, even in transit. To open the gate, he said, is to surrender the house. His words struck like steel on stone. The debate stretched deep into the night. Courtiers stood pale beneath the yellow lanterns, aware that whichever decision the king made would bind the kingdom's fate. Finally, the monarch spoke quietly. "We shall not yield our land to the hooves of strangers." It was not a shout, but a verdict. Days later, when the Mongol envoys demanded their answer, the court refused them outright. Some historians note that one envoy grew insolent, boasting of how swiftly Mongol banners could reach the capital if provoked. The Trun officials responded coldly, and the delegation was detained. This act, the arrest of Kublai Khan's representatives, shattered all possibility of negotiation. Word of it traveled north faster than any army could march. In the frontier garrisons, soldiers began reinforcing ramparts. The smell of tar and wet timber filled the air as new stakes were driven into the riverbanks. Messengers galloped from village to village bearing sealed orders. The royal foundries worked day and night to forge arrowheads and spear points. The elephant keepers, whose herds grazed near the Red River, scrubbed the hides of their beasts with salt and oil, fitting them with armor plates of hardened leather. The beasts bellowed, shaking their chains as if sensing what was to come. In Thonglong itself, the atmosphere grew heavy. Courtiers moved through the palace halls like shadows. Behind closed doors, ministers argued in hushed voices. The Queen Mother, wise and serene, urged prudence. The generals demanded action. The corridors, lined with stone dragons and flickering lamps, became the silent witnesses of a kingdom bracing for war. Meanwhile, far to the northwest in Yunnan, modern southwestern China, a different kind of silence reigned. In the fortified camp near the mountains, Mongol commander Uriyangkadai, son of the legendary general Subutai, studied maps by the light of a brazier. He had fought in Tibet and across the Himalayas. He understood terrain, hardship, and endurance. Yet the jungles of David were something new. His scouts returned with reports of steep passes, thick forests, and rivers that flooded without warning. None of it deterred him. To a Mongol, obstacles were invitations to conquest. Uriyangkadai's army, though smaller than those that had taken Persia or Russia, was composed of hardened veterans, horse archers from the steppe, Chinese engineers from the north, and local auxiliaries recruited in Yunnan. War horses, restless and lean, pawed the frozen soil as the commanders prepared for departure. Their task was simple: invade David, secure passage, and crush resistance before turning their attention southward. But as with all campaigns conceived in the cold clarity of imperial halls, the reality would prove far less predictable. To understand this invasion, one must grasp the broader design of Mongol strategy. After subduing the Jin and the Song, Kublai Khan envisioned a unified empire stretching to the edges of the sea. Southeast Asia was not merely a geographical curiosity. It was a vital link in maritime trade, connecting China's ports to the Indian Ocean and beyond. Control of Đại Việt would secure overland routes from Yunnan to the Gulf of Tonkin, modern Bukbo Bay, and provide access to the kingdoms further south. As chronicled in contemporary records and summarized by historians, the Mongols saw Đại Việt as a corridor state, a stepping stone for deeper expansion. They did not yet intend full annexation, but expected obedience. The Trun court, however, understood the pattern. Cooperation today meant conquest tomorrow. Thus, even before the first Mongol hoof struck Vietnamese soil, the kingdom had decided to resist. The tension between these two perspectives transformed the border into a line of fate. Along the passes of Lao Cai and Ha Giang, modern northern Vietnam, scouts exchanged arrows with Mongol advance parties. The thick mist of the mountains muffled every sound except the occasional clang of metal or the cry of an unseen bird. Villagers fled to the valleys, carrying children and rice sacks on their backs. Temples along the frontier began nightly prayers for peace, but the monks knew peace would not come soon. Within the royal city, the atmosphere mirrored the border's tension. The palace's lacquered doors remained closed, but news filtered in. Mongol camps had appeared near the frontier. The king summoned his council once more. This time, the tone was different. There was no longer debate about whether war would come, only how to face it. Orders were issued to the local lords. Garrisons in the northern provinces fortified their citadels. The riverside towns were evacuated, their granaries emptied to prevent enemy plunder. War drums were tested. Banners dyed in crimson and gold unfurled above the city walls. Every household contributed supplies. Bamboo poles for traps, iron for weapons, grain for the troops. Yet beyond the noise of preparation, there was fear. Not only of the Mongols' reputation for slaughter, but of the unknown. No one in living memory had faced such an enemy. Tales from merchants spoke of invincible cavalry and cities turned to ash. Mothers whispered prayers over their sleeping children, wondering if the Red River would soon run red again. The Trun court maintained a facade of calm. Diplomats were dispatched northward, with messages couched in formal courtesy, buying time for fortifications to be completed. But Kublai Khan's patience was short. To him, the arrest of his envoys was an affront to imperial dignity. He ordered Uriyangkadai to march. As the Mongol army began its descent from the highlands of Yunnan into what is now Lao Cai, the jungle swallowed them. The air grew thick, the soil slick with rain. Horses slipped on moss-covered rocks, and supply wagons sank into the mud. Local guides, often coerced from mountain tribes, vanished into the forest at night, leaving the invaders disoriented. But Uriyangkadai was relentless. Each day, his troops advanced a little farther, building makeshift bridges, cutting paths through the trees, marking the trail with the smell of smoke. To the people of Đại Việt, this was not just a foreign invasion. It was the awakening of an old memory. Generations earlier, their ancestors had driven out Chinese rulers and reclaimed independence. Now they faced an empire even larger and more ruthless. The Trun king, aware of history's weight, reminded his generals that courage was not measured by the size of one's army, but by the strength of one's heart. By the end of that year, the frontier had become a restless borderland of skirmishes. Mongol scouts clashed with local militias. Riverside watchtowers sent up columns of smoke to warn of approaching troops. The air carried the mingled scents of rain, resin, and iron. Tensions spread beyond the frontier. In Thang Long, the court's corridors were filled with hurried footsteps and the low murmur of messengers delivering dispatches. Within the royal armory, workers wrapped sword hilts in leather and polished bronze shields until they gleamed like mirrors. The elephants were moved closer to the capital. Their handlers whispered to them as though speaking to comrades. The mood among the people was a mix of dread and grim pride. Every man knew that defending the kingdom would demand sacrifice. Farmers left their fields to join the militias. Monks tended to the wounded even before the first major battle was fought. The very rhythm of daily life changed. The kingdom had entered a state of readiness. By the first months of 1258, it was clear that the Mongols were coming in force. Uriyangkadai's banners had been sighted near the frontier passes. The wind carried the faint sound of drums and hooves, an omen of what was to follow. In those final days before the storm, the Trun King walked alone along the walls of his citadel, looking northward into the darkness. The night air smelled of rain and burning oil. Behind him, the capital slept uneasily. Ahead, beyond the mountains, the most formidable army in human history was advancing toward his land. The warning at the frontier had become a promise of war. Đại Việt, the small nation between empires, stood waiting, its soldiers poised, its people united, its fate about to be tested in fire. The winter morning of the 17th day of the first month in the year 1258 broke gray and cold over the plains of Bakhak, an area that today lies within Vinh Phúc province, north of Hanoi. Mist curled low along the banks where the Low River met the Red River, and the reeds trembled in the wind. To the south, the banners of Đại Việt flickered crimson and gold in the pale light. To the north, dark waves of horsemen gathered, their armor glinting like shards of ice. The two worlds that had watched one another for months were finally about to collide. Uriyangkadai, the Mongol commander, had chosen his position carefully. He understood the value of space, of motion, of terror. His army had descended from the highlands of Yunnan through treacherous passes, losing men to disease and exhaustion, but they remained disciplined. He arranged them in long lines across the open plain, cavalry in the center, and Chinese crossbowmen on either flank. Behind them, the supply wagons creaked under the weight of arrows, dried meat, and bundles of bamboo to be used for bridges or traps. Across the field, the banners of Đại Việt stretched in disciplined ranks. The royal army, summoned by Emperor Trần Thái Tông, had marched north to confront the invaders before they could reach the heart of the kingdom. Their campfires had burned all night. Now the smell of smoke and resin lingered over the field. Elephants stood in formation, great gray mountains of muscle and armor, their tusks sheathed in bronze, their backs carrying archers in lacquered helmets. Around them, infantrymen waited in silence, spears planted in the wet ground. When the horns of the Mongols sounded, the earth seemed to shudder. Arrows hissed through the air, striking shields with the sound of breaking bamboo. The Vietnamese ranks held for a moment, then surged forward. The elephants advanced first, trumpeting so loudly that even the Mongol horses quivered. Behind them came waves of infantry shouting the name of the king. For a heartbeat, it appeared that the sheer weight of the charge might break the enemy line. Then the Mongol archers began to fire low. Uriyangkadai, calm and deliberate, had studied the enemy's tactics. He had learned that the elephants were both strength and weakness. With a single command, thousands of archers shifted their aim, and a rain of arrows struck at the animals' legs and bellies. Pierced by pain, the great beasts screamed and reared. Some turned, crashing back through their own lines, scattering soldiers like stalks of rice before a flood. From the royal vantage point, Emperor Trần Thái Tông saw the chaos unfold. He was mounted on one of the lead elephants, his armor glimmering beneath the morning light, sweat mingling with dust and the scent of iron. Around him, the air vibrated with the roar of men and beasts. He raised his sword and shouted for his troops to regroup, but the noise swallowed his voice. His archers continued to fire, yet their arrows fell short of the enemy riders who moved like wind across the field. On the opposite side, Uriyangkadai watched without expression. To him, this was the rhythm of victory he knew well: provoke, confuse, surround. He lifted his hand, and the center of his formation opened just enough for the cavalry to pour through. The Mongol riders advanced in a wedge, arrows flying in measured volleys. The Vietnamese lines, already shaken by their own panicked elephants, began to buckle. As the morning sun pierced through the mist, the field at Binh Lệ Nguyen became a cauldron of dust and blood. Horses screamed as they fell, men stumbled over the wounded and dying. The Mongol cavalry cut deep into the Vietnamese ranks, circling, dividing, striking from behind. The discipline of the Trun troops held for a time, but the ground favored the swift and the mounted. The elephants, meant to be the hammer of the army, had become obstacles in the mud. Still, the Vietnamese fought fiercely. Clusters of soldiers formed around their standards, shielding their commanders and refusing to yield. They fought with long spears, swords, and even farming tools, anything that could cut or pierce. Yet for each man who fell, two Mongol riders seemed to appear. The noise became unbearable, the clatter of armor, the hiss of arrows, the dull thud of hooves on wet earth. By midday, the Trun forces began to withdraw in organized groups, covering one another's retreat. Emperor Trun Taitung, his armor streaked with dirt and blood, was persuaded by his generals to pull back before encirclement. It was not cowardice, but preservation. The battle was lost, but the war was not. The royal banners retreated south toward the Red River, pursued but not destroyed. Uriyang-Khaddai did not order a chase. His army was weary, and he knew better than to extend too far into enemy territory without clear supply lines. The Mongol commander advanced cautiously toward Tanglong. When the city gates came into view, they were already abandoned. The inhabitants had fled, taking with them what supplies they could carry. Fires smoldered in the streets, and the echo of footsteps had long faded. Uriyang-Khaddai entered the capital with his horsemen, finding little but silence and the smell of smoke. For 9 days, the Mongols occupied Tanglong. They looted granaries and workshops, but they found no resistance, only empty houses and booby-trapped wells. The climate was heavy and strange to them. The humid air made their armor rust and their horses sick. Food began to spoil, and disease whispered through the camps. Reports arrived that the Song armies were regrouping in the south, and Uriyang-Khaddai realized that lingering would bring ruin. He ordered the retreat. The Mongols withdrew northward along the same passes through which they had come, burning villages and seizing livestock to feed their men. Yet the retreat was not a triumphal procession. Guerrilla bands of Vietnamese soldiers harried their flanks, striking from the forests, vanishing into the fog. By the time the army reached the border of Yunnan, hundreds of men had fallen to ambushes or illness. When news of the withdrawal reached Tanglong, the people emerged from hiding. The royal court returned, rebuilding what little had been destroyed. Emperor Trun Taitung ordered that the capital be cleansed and offerings made to the fallen. Though the Mongols had captured the city, they had not conquered the kingdom. The Trun dynasty stood bruised but unbroken. In the official chronicles that followed, the Battle of Bin Lake Nguyen was recorded as both a defeat and a revelation. It had shown the Mongols' overwhelming skill in cavalry warfare, but also their limitations in an unfamiliar climate. For the Vietnamese, it was a bitter lesson. Elephants, once symbols of invincibility, had become liabilities on soft ground against swift horsemen. The court resolved never again to rely solely on them. Future wars would be fought with new strategies: fluid, evasive, adapted to rivers and forests rather than open plains. In the palace, that winter, the atmosphere was one of solemn determination. Ministers debated not how to avenge the defeat, but how to understand it. The generals who had survived the battle spoke of the enemy's discipline, of their uncanny ability to read the rhythm of combat. The king listened and nodded, his gaze fixed beyond the chamber walls. He knew this first encounter was not the end, but the beginning of a long contest that would decide the fate of his dynasty. To the north, Uriyang-Khaddai's report reached Kublai Khan. It was favorable enough. The enemy had been routed, the capital entered, tribute secured. Yet even the Mongol archives note that the campaign had been costly and incomplete. The commander's tone in his correspondence was cautious. The Vietnamese had fought stubbornly, he wrote, and the land itself resisted conquest. Thus ended the first thunderclap, not as a decisive conquest, but as the beginning of an echo that would return in later years with greater force. The fields of Bin Lek Nguyen would recover, rice would grow again where blood had been spilled, and the people of Đại Việt would carry the memory of that morning in their hearts. They had seen the power of the Mongols, and they had survived it. In the temples of Tanglong, incense rose for the dead, curling toward the rafters like silent vows. The priests whispered prayers that the spirits of the fallen would guide their descendants. Outside, the Red River rolled on, carrying away the ashes of battle toward the sea. The Mongols had come and gone, leaving behind fear, destruction, and a lesson written in fire, that even the mightiest storm could pass, and that endurance, not force, would determine who truly owned the land. And as the year turned, the Trun court began quietly to rebuild its strength. knowing that the shadow of the empire beyond the mountains would one day fall upon them again, and that next time, they would be ready. When the fires of Binlet Nguyen had faded and the Mongol army vanished beyond the northern hills, the land of Đại Việt fell into a silence that felt heavier than defeat. The smoke that had hung over the Red River Delta thinned, but in the capital Thăng Long, the air remained dense with unease. The battle had been lost, the capital occupied, and though the enemy had withdrawn, the memory of their speed and ferocity lingered like a wound that refused to close. Inside the royal citadel, the court of the Trần dynasty met in dim halls lit by oil lamps that trembled with every draft of cold wind. The emperor, Trần Thái Tông, now in the later years of his reign, sat upon the throne dressed in plain robes rather than ceremonial silk. His voice, calm but subdued, broke the stillness. "The enemy has gone," he said, "but not forever." Those present knew the truth in his words. The ministers and generals gathered around him. Trần Thủ Đô, the iron-willed patriarch of the dynasty, Trần Quang Khai, the scholar general whose mind was as sharp as his sword, and the younger princes who had fought at Binlet Nguyen and returned scarred but unbowed. They spoke cautiously, each aware that the kingdom's survival depended on more than bravery. The emperor announced a new edict. We must fortify, reorganize, and learn. His tone was measured, but the meaning was urgent. To the outside world, the court presented an image of serenity. Official proclamations spoke of peace restored, the capital rebuilt, and the king's health renewed. But beneath that calm surface, every chamber of the palace echoed with quiet determination. The military reforms began at once. The elephants, once symbols of royal might, were reduced in number and reassigned to transport and ceremonial duties. The lesson of Binlet Nguyen was unmistakable. On soft ground and against agile horsemen, the massive beasts were liabilities. Instead, the Trần commanders turned their attention to the rivers, the veins of the kingdom. The Red River, the Duong, and the Bac Dang became the focus of new defenses. Skilled boat builders in the villages along the riverbanks were summoned to Thăng Long to construct light, maneuverable warships. These vessels, narrow and swift, were designed to navigate the twisting channels and tidal flats where heavy cavalry could not follow. Soldiers trained to fight as marines, mastering both the sword and the oar. The navy, once a supporting arm, would now become the kingdom's spearhead. The emperor ordered the digging of new moats around the capital and the restoration of fortresses along the frontier. Warehouses were built in the provinces of Bắc Giang and Thái Nguyên to store grain and dried fish, provisions for a long defense. The court knew that victory in the next war would depend as much on food as on courage. A network of signal towers was constructed across the northern provinces, each equipped with drums and smoke signals to alert the capital of any invasion. In the palace, clerks worked day and night to record supply routes and troop rosters. Scribes inked new decrees on bamboo slips, while messengers carried orders across the kingdom. The sounds of hammers and saws rose from the shipyards, mingling with the chants of monks praying for the souls lost in battle. Đại Việt was rebuilding, not in the noise of celebration, but in the steady rhythm of preparation. To the north, the Yuan court in China received news of Uryankadai's partial victory. The campaign had technically succeeded. The enemy routed, the capital entered, tribute extracted. But the emperor, Kublai Khan, read between the lines. His commanders had faced disease, logistical failures, and unfamiliar terrain. The humid air had corroded armor. Horses had perished from exhaustion and parasites. Worse still, the Mongols' famed cavalry had been crippled by mud and narrow roads. The campaign had proven that the jungles of the south were not as easily conquered as the open plains of the north. Yuan strategists gathered to analyze the expedition. Reports emphasized the importance of supply lines and local cooperation. The Vietnamese terrain, they noted, rendered traditional steppe warfare ineffective. The rivers, unpredictable and wide, acted as both barriers and ambush points. The thick vegetation concealed entire battalions until it was too late. The conclusion reached in the imperial archives was telling. To conquer the south, one must first tame its water and its air. Kublai Khan, though preoccupied with consolidating his rule in China, did not forget Đại Việt. He accepted its tribute, silk, rare wood, and spices, and declared the kingdom a vassal state under the Yuan's heavenly mandate. Yet this relationship was more symbolic than real. The Trun court, while sending envoys to Beijing with carefully worded letters and gifts, maintained its independence in practice. The tribute missions were theater, gestures meant to buy time. Every caravan that traveled north carried not only gifts, but also spies disguised as merchants. They observed Mongol garrisons, routes, and supply depots, reporting back with maps and notes. The Trun rulers played a delicate game of diplomacy and deception, humble in word, resolute in action. Within the kingdom, reforms continued. The emperor's younger brother, Trun Hong, the future Trun Tung, took a leading role in reorganizing the civil administration. Taxes were adjusted to ensure that frontier provinces had resources to sustain prolonged campaigns. Villages were encouraged to train local militias under royal supervision. These were not large standing armies, but flexible units that could resist raids, sabotage enemy supply lines, and melt into the landscape when pursued. The court's attention also turned to intelligence. Networks of scouts were established along the border with Yunnan and Guangxi. They watched the movement of merchants, soldiers, and envoys alike. Villagers were trained to light signal fires at the first sight of foreign banners. It was said that by the year 1265, news of any troop movement north of the border could reach the capital in less than 3 days, an extraordinary feat for the time. Even as the kingdom fortified itself, the shadow of the previous war lingered. Veterans of Binleng carried scars both visible and hidden. Some had lost limbs, others had lost faith. The king visited them in their villages, offering land and grain, listening to their stories. Your suffering, he told them, is the foundation of our future strength. Those words spread among the people, rekindling pride in survival rather than shame in defeat. The capital itself began to transform. New gates were built, thicker walls raised, and canals expanded to facilitate movement of supplies. The once vulnerable Thonglong became a fortress city intertwined with waterways, a citadel that could not be easily surrounded or starved. Within its halls, the royal family prepared for succession. Emperor Trun Taitung, mindful of age and fatigue, began transferring authority to his son, Trun Tantong, ensuring that leadership would remain stable when the next storm arrived. Meanwhile, in Yunnan, Mongol engineers experimented with riverboats modeled after captured Vietnamese designs. They studied the failures of their first invasion, attempting to adapt their tactics. Yet even as they planned, the tropical climate continued to defeat them. Horses bred on the cold steppes died in droves under the southern sun. The men suffered fevers, and their armor rusted faster than it could be replaced. It was as if the land itself rejected them. Both empires watched each other from afar, bound by a fragile calm. Traders crossed the borders once more, carrying silk, salt, and stories. Diplomats exchanged polite letters full of ritual compliments. But beneath the veneer of civility, each side counted its weapons. The Trun generals knew that the Mongols had never truly accepted their setback, and the Mongols knew that David's submission was only nominal. By the end of the decade, the kingdom was transformed. The army was leaner, faster, more disciplined. The navy had become a formidable force, its sailors trained to fight on rivers and at sea. Supply lines stretched from the mountains to the coast, and fortifications bristled along the frontier. The people, hardened by memory, were ready to fight not just to defend a king, but to preserve the soul of their homeland. The historians of later centuries would look back on this period as one of quiet rebirth, a time when David, scarred but alive, turned inward to forge the strength that would one day astonish the world. The defeat at Binleng had been a wound, but it was also a teacher. It taught the kingdom how to endure, adapt, and wait. In the dim light of the royal library, as rain drummed softly on the tiled roof, a young prince, Trun Hung Dao, destined to become the greatest general of his age, read through the old chronicles of the battle. He studied the mistakes of his elders, the maps of the river systems, and the reports from spies along the frontier. When he closed the book, he whispered to himself a single vow. Next time, the rivers will fight with us. And in that vow, quietly spoken in the years of uneasy peace, the next chapter of David's defiance was already being written. By the early months of the year 1285, the uneasy peace that had endured for nearly 3 decades between David and the Yuan dynasty shattered. The couriers from the northern frontier arrived breathless at Thăng, modern Hanoi, their clothes spattered with mud, their eyes wild from exhaustion. Their message was short and heavy as iron. The Mongols are coming again. From the peaks of the border passes in Lang Son to the dense forests of Cao Bang, the horizon was black with banners bearing the falcon emblem of Kublai Khan. The second invasion of Đại Việt had begun, larger, deadlier, and more determined than the first. This time, the emperor himself was watching. Kublai Khan, now well entrenched as the ruler of China under the Yuan dynasty, had appointed his son Togan to command the campaign. Togan was young, but ambitious, eager to prove his worth. He was joined by a cadre of experienced generals, among them Arik Kaya, who led the main body through the passes of Nam Quan in modern Lang Son province, and Omar, commander of the naval fleet, who would advance from the eastern coast along the Duong River toward the Red River Delta. The plan was simple in theory and devastating in intent, a two-pronged assault by land and water that would crush Đại Việt in a pincer movement. The Northern Army would descend from the highlands, seize Thăng Long, and drive the Trun royal family southward. Meanwhile, the fleet would choke the rivers and cut off escape routes, ensuring the kingdom's total collapse. Yet what the Mongols did not know was that Đại Việt had changed since their first encounter. The kingdom they faced in 1285 was no longer a frightened land of elephants and infantry, but a disciplined network of commanders, scouts, and naval squadrons trained for the very terrain that had once hindered them. At the head of the defense stood Prince Trun Hung Dao, known formally as Trun Quoc Tuan, a man whose calm authority concealed the fire of a strategist. He had studied the tactics of his father's generation, their defeats and their triumphs, and had vowed to turn the rivers and forests of Đại Việt into living weapons. Around him gathered his most trusted lieutenants, Trun Quang Khai, scholar and warrior, Pham Ngu Lao, the young commander whose discipline inspired the troops, and countless local leaders who knew every bend of the river and every hidden path through the mountains. The royal capital buzzed with preparations. Messengers galloped through the night, relaying orders sealed with red wax. The docks of Thăng Long overflowed with warships. Carpenters hammered late into the evening, strengthening hulls and loading catapults. Monks from nearby temples came to bless the soldiers, sprinkling water mixed with herbs and ashes over their armor. To the north, the first clashes erupted in the highlands. Mongol vanguards stormed the border garrisons, cutting through outposts that resisted fiercely, but were too few to hold. Refugees poured southward, telling stories of villages burned and fields trampled under hooves. Still, the advance was slower than Togan had planned. The mountain passes of Nam Quan, now known as the Friendship Pass, were narrow and treacherous. Heavy supply wagons sank in the mud, and local ambushes struck at the rear lines. When the Mongol army finally descended into the Red River Plain, they found the countryside eerily empty. The fields had been harvested early, the granaries stripped, the wells poisoned. Smoke curled from abandoned villages, but no people remained. The Trun had enacted the strategy later remembered as Vuan Kong, Na Trong, empty fields and hollow houses. The enemy would find no food, no shelter, no guide. Still, the invaders pushed onward. The roar of hooves and the metallic jingle of armor rolled across the plains between the Khao River and the southern approach to Nam Dinh. The morning mists hung thick as curtains, muffling the world in silver fog. Somewhere within it, the sound of drums echoed, slow, deliberate, like the heartbeat of the land itself. At the same time, from the eastern sea, the Mongol fleet under Omar entered the Gulf of Bac Bo and began to sail up the Duong River, which today runs through Bắc Ninh province. The ships were heavy Chinese-style junks, carrying archers, engineers, and siege machines. Their hulls sliced through the muddy water as their banners streamed behind them. The aim was to link up with Togan's land army near Thăng Long and strike from two directions at once. The Vietnamese fleet, commanded by Trần Cảnh Du, shadowed them from a distance. His ships, smaller but faster, darted in and out of the river's bends, avoiding direct engagement. He had orders not to fight yet, only to observe and report. The real battle, he knew, would be decided by timing, not strength. In Thăng Long, Emperor Trần Nhân Tông convened his war council. The room was dark except for the flickering light of oil lamps. The air smelled of ink, sweat, and anticipation. "We face a storm from both land and sea," the emperor said. "We must not meet it head-on." His uncle, Trunhung bowed and replied, "Majesty, the strength of our land is not in open fields but in rivers, forests, and the hearts of our people." The emperor nodded. Orders were issued to withdraw the royal family to Thiên in Nam province, and to prepare Thăng for evacuation. The decision to abandon the capital was agonizing but necessary. The Trun knew that the Mongols valued the illusion of victory, the capture of cities and banners, more than the control of land. By yielding the city, they could preserve their army and strike when the enemy least expected. The people obeyed without protest. They had seen this strategy before and trusted it as part of a larger design. By late spring, the Mongol forces entered Thăng unopposed. The city lay silent, its markets deserted, its walls marked with soot from the fires the defenders had left behind. Togon raised his banner atop the citadel and proclaimed victory. For a moment, he believed the campaign was nearly over, but the real struggle had only just begun. South of the capital, along the rivers and in the forests of Thanh Hoa and Nghệ An, the Vietnamese forces gathered. Trunhung established his headquarters near Thiên Truong, drawing together units from every province. Camps dotted the riverbanks, soldiers trained with bamboo spears and iron blades. Supplies were ferried down hidden canals under the cover of night. The Mongols soon discovered that the emptiness of the cities was an illusion. Supply convoys vanished. Boats loaded with rice disappeared into tributaries that led nowhere. Scouts sent to pursue the retreating Trun troops never returned. The heat grew unbearable, the swamps bred mosquitoes, and the monsoon rains turned roads into rivers of mud. For every village they burned, another seemed to appear behind them, ready to ambush and fade away. Meanwhile, Trunhung launched small, precise strikes. His units would emerge from the forest, attack isolated outposts, and vanish again before dawn. Mongol horses, unused to the humid air and soft soil, weakened quickly. The invincible cavalry that had conquered half the world found itself mired in rice paddies and trapped between rivers that changed course with the tides. Pham Ngu Lao led one such ambush near the confluence of the Duong and Red Rivers. His men, camouflaged among reeds, struck at night with spears tipped in fire. The sudden assault destroyed several Mongol supply boats and sent panic rippling through the fleet. From the darkness came the war cry of Đại Việt, "Sát that! Kill the Tartars!" The cry echoed across the water, fierce and defiant. By the middle of the campaign, the Mongols faced a crisis of sustenance. Their enormous army consumed supplies faster than the Yuan quartermasters could deliver them. Even as Togon held the capital, his soldiers were starving. Letters from his generals begged for more rice, more medicine, more reinforcements. Disease spread through the camps, and discipline began to fray. The Trun generals seized the moment. Using the rivers as their allies, they isolated and attacked the Mongol detachments piecemeal. Villagers guided Vietnamese boats through secret channels unknown to the invaders. Entire flotillas of Mongol ships were set ablaze in narrow inlets where the wind trapped the smoke and flames. As summer deepened, the sounds of war rolled across the land. The beating of drums from distant hills, the cry of elephants, the ring of steel on wood. At dawn, mist blanketed the Ko River, and through it came the muffled thunder of hooves. The Mongols, exhausted yet unyielding, pressed onward, unaware that each step drew them closer to the trap that would later be sprung at Trung Duong and Tay Ket. For now, Đại Việt still stood on the defensive, its people weary but resolute. The enemy had numbers and prestige. The defenders had the land and patience. Between the mists of the rivers and the shadows of the forests, the fate of the kingdom waited to be written. The campaign of 1285 had begun, and the drums of war would not fall silent until one side was broken. The 24th day of the 6th month in the year 1285 dawned beneath a low, heavy sky. The Red River, swollen from summer rains, moved like molten bronze under the mist. Along its banks, near the port of Trung Duong, in what is now Hanoi, lay the converging destinies of two empires. The Mongol Yuan fleet, commanded by the experienced general Sogetu, had advanced deep into Đại Việt, its ships crowding the muddy waters. Opposite them, hidden in the reeds and inlets, the naval forces of Đại Việt prepared for an assault that would shift the course of the entire war. For weeks, the invaders had occupied Thanglang, believing victory to be assured. Togon, Kublai Khan's son, had raised his standard above the capital and sent messengers north proclaiming triumph. Yet that triumph had begun to rot. His troops were starving, his horses dying, and his fleets, once the proud expression of Yuan might, had become stagnant hulks anchored along the riverbanks, vulnerable to an enemy they could no longer see. It was into this setting that Trun Quang Kai and Pham Ngu Lao, two of the most formidable commanders under Trun Hung Dao, brought the river to life. They had studied the enemy's positions, the depths of the current, and the direction of the wind. The plan was simple, brutal, and elegant, to strike at dawn with fire and fury before the Mongols could maneuver their heavier ships. When the first horns sounded, the river was still shrouded in fog. The Mongol sailors strained to see through the gray veil, their armor slick with humidity. From the north bank, faint drums began to beat, slow at first, then rising in tempo. A cry echoed over the water, "Sat Tat," the war cry of Đại Việt. Then, from the mist, the Vietnamese fleet surged forward. Sleek warboats, painted dark to blend with the river, glided silently until they were almost within bowshot. Suddenly, the silence broke. Arrows rained across the decks of the Yuan ships. Clay pots filled with burning oil and pitch arced through the air, smashing against hulls and rigging. Flames spread in sudden sheets of orange light, licking up the masts. The Mongols shouted orders in confusion. Sogedu, the veteran commander, rushed to restore order, directing his men to form a defensive line across the channel. But the current, swollen by recent rains, betrayed them. The heavy junks swung broadside, colliding with one another. The narrowness of the river turned discipline into chaos. From their smaller, faster craft, Vietnamese archers unleashed volleys of arrows tipped with fire. The heat of the flames mingled with the humidity until the air itself seemed to burn. Smoke rolled across the water, turning noon into twilight. Beneath the roar of battle came another sound, the creak of wooden hulls splitting under pressure, and the hiss of steam where fire met the river's surface. Pham Ngu Lao, commanding from the front lines, led a boarding attack against a cluster of enemy vessels trapped near the southern bank. He was barely 30 years old, but his presence was fierce and unyielding. As his ship collided with the enemy flagship, he leapt across the gap with sword drawn. His men followed, shouting, their feet splashing through water that was already red with blood. They cut down the Yuan sailors and set the ship ablaze from within. Meanwhile, Trun Quang Kai coordinated the wider battle. From his command vessel, he signaled the reserve forces to close off escape routes downstream. "No one leaves the river alive," he ordered. His tone was calm, almost cold. The success of the entire counteroffensive depended on complete annihilation. By mid-morning, the Red River was an inferno. Smoke curled toward the clouds, thick and dark as storm banners. The reflection of fire on the water made it seem as though the river itself bled. Soldiers fought not only the enemy but the current, struggling to stay upright amid wreckage and drifting corpses. The Mongols, renowned for their prowess on horseback, found themselves clumsy and desperate in the alien element of water. Sogedu, trapped aboard his flagship, continued to resist. He was a commander of great courage, a veteran of the Yuan conquest of the Southern Song. But courage could not save him. Vietnamese fireboats, loaded with straw and pitch, drifted toward his position. His archers tried to repel them, but the wind turned against him. One fireboat struck his ship amidships. The explosion was deafening. Flames engulfed the deck in seconds. When the smoke cleared, the great general was gone, his armor sinking into the depths of the Red River. The cry went up among the Vietnamese, "The tiger has fallen." The tide of battle shifted from desperate struggle to total rout. The surviving Yuan ships tried to retreat, but Trun Quang Kai's fleet had already sealed the downstream exit. One by one, the invaders' vessels were captured or destroyed. By noon, the once mighty Mongol flotilla was nothing but drifting ash and shattered masts. On the riverbank, the soldiers of Đại Việt stood exhausted but exultant. They had turned the Red River into a graveyard for an empire's ambition. The air was thick with smoke and the scent of burning pitch. Some men wept openly, not from sorrow, but from disbelief that they had survived and triumphed. Trun Quang Kai disembarked, walking through the debris-strewn shallows. His armor was scorched, his face streaked with soot, but his eyes shone with quiet resolve. Beside him, Famgu Lao knelt beside a captured Mongol banner, its silk torn and blackened. "It is done, my lord," he said simply. Trần Quang Khai nodded, gazing out over the smoldering river. "No," he replied softly, "it has only begun." The victory at Cheongdeung was more than a military triumph. It was a transformation. For the first time, the invincible Mongol war machine had been decisively defeated on water, and not by a great empire, but by a small kingdom that refused to yield. The psychological impact was immense. Word of the battle spread swiftly through the countryside. Villagers who had fled their homes returned to rebuild. The army's morale soared, while the Yuan troops, once feared as demons, now appeared mortal. Strategically, the consequences were profound. The destruction of the Yuan fleet crippled Togon's campaign. Cut off from supplies and reinforcements, his army in Thonglong began to starve. Communication between land and sea forces collapsed. The Mongol command, once coordinated and confident, fell into confusion. From his field headquarters, Trần Hung Dao received the news of victory with solemn pride. He ordered immediate preparations for the next strike, knowing that the enemy, though weakened, was still dangerous. The counteroffensive would continue southward, driving the invaders from the capital and reclaiming the kingdom's heart. As the day faded into dusk, the river's surface reflected a haunting beauty. Crimson light mingled with the last traces of smoke. The bodies of men and wreckage drifted silently downstream, carried by the same current that had witnessed countless wars before. On the bank, musicians played slow, mournful notes on bamboo flutes, honoring the dead of both sides. The soldiers gathered around campfires that night, sharing rice and stories. Some had lost brothers, others their closest friends, but all knew that something greater had been achieved, a turning of fate. They spoke of the river as if it were alive, a guardian spirit that had chosen to rise in their defense. In the royal court at Thiên Truong, when news of the victory arrived, Emperor Trần Nhân Tông ordered that the temples across the land light incense in gratitude. He decreed 3 days of offerings for the fallen, and his words were carried by riders to every province. The people answered with prayers and songs, their faith in their leaders and their land rekindled. The Battle of Cheongdeung became legend almost at once. Chroniclers described the flames that devoured the enemy fleet as a sunrise upon the river of blood. Poets wrote that the Red River had turned crimson, not from slaughter, but from the pride of a nation reborn. By striking at the heart of the invaders' fleet, Đại Việt had done what few nations had ever achieved. It had forced the Mongol Empire onto the defensive. The wind of war had shifted. From that day forward, the invaders would no longer march with arrogance through Vietnamese lands. They would march with fear. And as the moon rose above the smoking ruins of the river, its pale light glimmered upon the broken armor of friend and foe alike. The water, once a weapon, now whispered softly around the wreckage, carrying with it the promise that the struggle was far from over. But that, for the first time, victory was within reach. When the fires of Cheongdeung still glowed red along the riverbanks, the armies of the Yuan were already beginning to unravel. What had once been a campaign of conquest had become a slow march into exhaustion. Togon, son of Kublai Khan, who had entered Đại Việt with confidence and ceremony, now found himself surrounded by silence. The silence of empty fields, ruined supply lines, and dying soldiers. The summer of 1285 in the Red River Delta was merciless. The monsoon rains came heavier than usual, turning the ground into a slick expanse of mud. The humid air clung to skin and armor alike. Food spoiled within days, horses grew sick, and men weakened from fever. The Mongol soldiers, bred for the open steppes, could not bear the heat. Their bodies, encased in heavy iron plates, became furnaces beneath the tropical sun. The first to suffer were the supply trains. The vast army that had marched proudly through the passes of Nam Quan in modern Lang Son province depended on grain shipped down from Yunnan and carried along precarious routes through mountains and rivers. But now those routes were cut. The Vietnamese ambushed convoys in the forests, burned warehouses along the rivers, and poisoned wells. Entire caravans disappeared in the mist. Country Studies describes the scene as one of slow suffocation rather than sudden defeat. The Yuan army, though still disciplined, was trapped in an environment that devoured strength and morale. Food rations dwindled. Commanders ordered horses slaughtered for meat. Disease spread unchecked. Dysentery, malaria, and fevers with no known cure. The physicians who tended the soldiers could do little but offer herbs and prayers. Meanwhile, the Trun commanders tightened the noose. Trun Hungdao had long predicted that the Mongols' greatest weakness would not be their courage, but their stomachs. His strategy, Vun Kung, Nya Trung, empty fields and hollow houses, was not simply abandonment. It was weaponized starvation. Villages were evacuated in advance of the enemy's approach. Granaries were emptied and livestock driven deep into the mountains. The land itself turned traitor to the invaders, offering nothing but hunger. Facts and details records that the Trun armies avoided major engagements during this phase. They struck like ghosts, sudden, precise, and devastating, then vanished into forests and waterways. The Mongols, who thrived on decisive battles, found themselves fighting shadows. Even when they managed to capture local guides, those guides often led them in circles, through jungles that seemed endless. At the heart of the collapsing front was Togon's command base at Van Kip, located near modern Haidung province, between the Red and Luknam rivers. Once a thriving encampment, it had become a wasteland of tents and corpses. The air reeked of sweat, decay, and the sickly sweetness of rotting grain. Inside the command tent, the scene was one of despair. Reports lay scattered across the table. Messages from Sogetu's fleet, now silent after Chungdeung. From Arik Kaya's divisions, which were isolated and starving. From local garrisons begging for relief that would never come. Togon sat in silence as his advisors argued around him. The flickering lamplight cast long shadows on the silk map spread before him. His armor was stained, his eyes hollow. Each courier who entered brought worse news than the last. One reported that half the horses in the southern regiment had died from disease. Another said that the river barges meant to carry rice from the coast had been sunk by fire. He stood at last and walked to the entrance of his tent. Beyond it, the camp stretched into the darkness. Thousands of tents, their canvas sagging with rain. Fires sputtered in the damp wind. The soldiers, once proud riders of the steppe, now crouched beneath makeshift shelters, coughing from fever and swatting at clouds of mosquitoes. The cries of the sick mingled with the distant rumble of thunder. Togon's aides found him there, motionless, his face unreadable. "We cannot feed them," one whispered. "If we stay, we die here." The young prince nodded slowly. The decision, though inevitable, felt like a betrayal of his father's faith and his empire's pride. "Then we will withdraw," he said. "We will live to fight again." The retreat began quietly at first, under the cover of night. Units were ordered to dismantle camps, burn anything they could not carry, and march north toward the passes. But secrecy was impossible. The Vietnamese scouts saw the movement at once. To the south of Thang Long, Trun Hungdao and his generals watched from the shadows. "They are breaking," said Pham Wu Lao, still scarred from the battle at Chungdeung. "Yes," Hungdao replied, "and now they will bleed as they go." He issued orders for coordinated harassment. Small detachments were to pursue, but not overextend, striking only when the retreat slowed. The roads northward became killing grounds. Rain turned the paths into rivers. Bridges collapsed under the weight of carts. Vietnamese archers fired from the tree line, then vanished before counterattack. Supply wagons burst into flames as ambushers struck and disappeared into the mist. The retreating army left behind not only their dead, but their discipline. By the end of June, the Mongol troops abandoned Thang Long altogether. The once proud capital, which they had entered in triumph, was now a ghost city. Fires smoldered in the streets, and the scent of rot filled the air. When the Trun forces returned, led by banners still damp with rain, they found the citadel stripped of treasure but intact. The people emerged from hiding, their faces thin but radiant with joy. Bells rang from the temples. Farmers knelt in the fields to give thanks. The emperor, Trun Nun Tung, entered the capital in silence. He dismounted before the palace gates and bowed to the earth. "The city is ours again," he said. Then he turned to his generals. "But remember, this victory belongs not to our swords, but to our patience." Behind them, the Red River carried the debris of war. Broken boats, floating armor, the detritus of an army that had believed itself unstoppable. The invincible empire had retreated, undone not by superior weapons, but by the slow, unyielding resistance of the land and its people. For the Yuan dynasty, the campaign was a humiliation. Reports that reached Beijing were vague, their tone defensive. Commanders blamed the monsoon, the terrain, or the perfidy of local allies. But Kublai Khan knew better. He recognized that the South had swallowed his armies whole, not through strength of arms, but through endurance. His letters to Togon were stern but restrained. "You have tested their river and their heart," he wrote. "Next time, know both before you march." In David, the mood was electric. Songs were sung in the marketplaces. Chroniclers inked their brushes to record the miracle of survival. The people spoke of the Mongols' retreat as divine justice, heaven itself, avenging the burning of villages and the desecration of temples. Yet the generals knew that the struggle was far from over. The Yuan Empire was vast and wealthy. Another invasion would surely come. Even as they celebrated, preparations resumed. Ships repaired, fortresses reinforced, and scouts dispatched once more toward the border. But for that moment, at least, the kingdom breathed freely. The banners of the Trun flew again over Thonglong, their fabric still wet from the rain. The sound of temple gongs rolled across the city like distant thunder. Not the thunder of war, but of renewal. For the Mongols, the retreat from David marked more than a failure of logistics. It was a revelation that the small kingdom they had dismissed as a footnote in their empire was, in truth, a fortress built of will. The climate had been against them, yes. Disease and hunger had taken their toll. But what defeated them most was something no army could overcome: a people who had mastered the art of endurance. As the rains subsided and the first clear dawn broke over the Red River, the land seemed to breathe again. The mist lifted from the water, revealing fields once burned, now sprouting with green. In the capital, a monk rang the morning bell, its echo carrying over the rooftops. The war was not yet over, but the balance had shifted. David had proven that even the mightiest invader could falter, not in battle, but in the long, quiet war of survival. And somewhere beyond the northern passes, Togon rode in silence, the memory of the suffocating heat and endless rain etched into his mind. Knowing that the empire he served had just met an enemy it could not easily subdue. Even as the echoes of battle still rolled over the rivers and valleys of David, a colder conflict was brewing behind the closed doors of the royal citadel. Victory on the battlefield had come at a cost, and in its aftermath, the royal court, like a wounded beast, began to turn inward. Whispers of ambition crept through the marble corridors of Thonglong, and in the flicker of oil lamps, among the silken robes and measured bows, a shadow took shape. The shadow of betrayal. The man at its center was a prince, Trun Ik-tak, fifth son of Emperor Trun Tai-tung, younger brother of the late Trun Thun-tung, and uncle to the reigning monarch, Trun Yun-tung. Born into privilege and gifted with intelligence and charm, Ik-tak had long been admired in the court for his refinement. He was a scholar, a poet, and a man of exquisite manners. Yet behind the grace lay resentment. Resentment toward those who had risen higher than he in both power and glory. When the Mongols first invaded, Ik-tak had served in the capital, ostensibly loyal, but as the war dragged on, his envy deepened. He saw his nephew, the young emperor, celebrated as a ruler of courage and piety. He saw Trun Hungdao revered as the hero of Chengdung, and he saw himself overlooked. The court chroniclers would later write that he possessed all the pride of nobility, but none of its virtue. It began with murmurs in the darkened halls. Messengers came and went at night, their faces hidden beneath hoods. Courtiers gathered in small groups, speaking in low voices that ceased whenever a guard approached. The scent of incense masked the faint smell of fear. Behind carved wooden screens, the prince listened as his confidant spoke of opportunity. That the Yuan Empire, humiliated but unbroken, was preparing another campaign, and that perhaps, if one within the royal family were willing to cooperate, the next invasion need not end in blood. Outside the palace, the city was still recovering from the devastation of war. But within its walls, ambition outweighed exhaustion. Ich-tak began corresponding secretly with Yuan envoys along the border. The letters, written in refined Chinese calligraphy, were offers thinly veiled as pleas for peace. He presented himself as a man of reason, one who sought to restore harmony between North and South. In truth, he proposed an alliance that would place him on the throne as a ruler under Mongol protection. According to Wikipedia and later Vietnamese chronicles, Kublai Khan's court received these letters with great interest. The idea of a pliant monarch in Đại Việt, one who would govern in the Yuan's name, was appealing. The emperor approved the proposal in principle and instructed his generals to prepare the road for the loyal prince. Thus, what began as treasonous correspondence soon evolved into imperial strategy. While the court in Thăng Long celebrated its recent victories, the seeds of the next invasion were already being sown. The Mongols now had a pretext. They would not be invaders but restorers, coming to place the rightful ruler, Trân Ích Thach, upon the throne. The palace atmosphere grew tense. Rumors spread, but few dared speak openly. Servants whispered of strange visitors to the prince's residence at night. One evening, a loyal eunuch overheard a conversation between each Thach's aides, a conversation that made his blood run cold. He fled into the rain, slipping through side passages until he reached the quarters of the Grand Commander, Trân Hung Dao. Hung Dao received the news in silence. The flickering oil lamp between them cast long shadows across his face. The eunuch trembled, but the general's expression remained calm, a calm born not of surprise but of understanding. He had suspected something for months. "So it begins," he murmured. He dismissed the messenger with a reward and then turned to his aides. "The Mongols may come with banners," he said, "but it is treachery within that opens the gate." His words carried neither anger nor despair, only the weary wisdom of a man who had fought too many battles to believe that enemies were always outside the walls. In the days that followed, Hung Dao quietly tightened control over the army and the palace guard. Loyal officers were placed in charge of critical posts, communication with the frontier was increased, and spies were dispatched to trace the prince's contacts. The emperor was informed in measured terms. Trân Nhân Tông, deeply pious and gentle by nature, was said to have wept when he learned of his uncle's betrayal. "He bears our blood," the emperor said softly, "yet he would sell it to foreigners." The court moved cautiously. To expose the conspiracy too soon might give the Yuan an excuse to intervene. To do nothing would invite disaster. Ishtak continued to appear at ceremonies, bowing to the throne and reciting verses in praise of peace, while his eyes darted like those of a man measuring the distance to the door. When the next Mongol invasion began, the third and greatest, it was said that each Thach had already fled north. Yuan sources claim he crossed the border into Guangxi, accompanied by retainers and servants, seeking refuge at the imperial court. Vietnamese accounts are harsher. They describe his departure as a defection, the act of a man who chose ambition over honor. In Beijing, he was received with courtesy and granted the title of King of Annam, a mock crown meant to legitimize the invasion that was to follow. In the palace of Thăng Long, the news struck like a blade. To the people, each Thach's name became synonymous with treachery. Poets spat curses into their ink. Monks struck gongs for the cleansing of the dynasty's shame. Yet the royal court, guided by Hung Dao's steady hand, responded not with panic, but with resolve. "We will not answer words with words," the general told the emperor. "We will answer them with victories." He understood that the greatest danger of betrayal was not the traitor himself, but the doubt he sowed in others. If the people believed the royal family divided, their unity, their strongest weapon, would crumble. To counter that, the emperor launched a campaign of confidence. He traveled among the provinces, visiting temples, blessing farmers, and personally addressing the troops. "Our brothers may falter," he told them, "but our land does not." His calm presence steadied the nation, turning shock into determination. At the same time, the court purged those suspected of collusion. Some were exiled to remote monasteries, others quietly disappeared. The surviving princes swore oaths of loyalty before the ancestral tablets, their voices echoing in the hall of incense. "The throne of Trân," they declared, "shall never bow to the north." The betrayal of Trân Ích Thach became more than a scandal. It became a rallying point. His treachery clarified what was at stake, not merely territory or power, but identity. If he symbolized submission to empire, then those who resisted embodied the very soul of Đại Việt. In Beijing, the Yuan generals finalized their plans. Trân Ích Thach, installed in a gilded chamber within the imperial palace, served as both pawn and symbol. The court chroniclers recorded his proclamations calling for peaceful unification under Yuan protection. The irony was bitter. He who had once walked beneath the golden eaves of Thonglong now walked as a guest among conquerors, a prince without a country. For Kublai Khan, however, the arrangement was perfect. The coming invasion could now be justified not as conquest, but as restoration, a noble enterprise to enthrone a loyal ruler. The strategists called it the An-Nam expedition. Those who had fought and died in the earlier wars would see their sacrifices vindicated, or so they were told. Thus, out of one man's ambition grew the rationale for the third Mongol invasion. What had begun as whispered envy in the corridors of Thonglong now hardened into imperial policy in the halls of Beijing. Back in Viet, as the summer winds swept through the lotus ponds of the royal gardens, Trần Hưng Đạo stood on the terrace of the citadel, looking north. The lamps of the capital shimmered in the distance, like stars reflected in water. He thought of the prince who had traded loyalty for vanity, and of the storm that would soon follow. "Let them come," he said quietly to his aide. "We have faced their armies before. We will face them again, with clean hearts." And so the shadow of betrayal, instead of breaking the kingdom, sharpened it. From the ashes of deceit rose a fiercer unity. The court that had once whispered in fear now spoke with one voice. For they knew that the next war would not simply be fought for survival, but for the honor of a name, and that name was Trần. By the autumn of 1287, the horizon darkened once more with the banners of the north. The fields that had barely recovered from the last invasion were again haunted by rumors of marching armies and fleets heavy with iron. The Yuan dynasty had not forgotten its humiliation. In the halls of Beijing, Kublai Khan's patience had turned to fury. His son Togon, though shamed by his retreat 3 years earlier, was summoned once again to lead the campaign. This would not be a mere punitive raid, but a grand expedition. The final tempest meant to break Đại Việt once and for all. The preparations began in early autumn. From the mountains of Yunnan came the infantry and cavalry divisions, hardened veterans of the steppes and the forests. Their orders were clear. March south through the same passes as before, descend into the Red River Delta, and crush the resistance. At the same time, a vast fleet assembled in the harbors of southern China, drawn from both Yuan and annexed Song sailors. The admirals Omar and Zhang Wenhu commanded it, the former an experienced general from the Middle East who had served the Mongols in previous wars, the latter a Chinese naval officer of considerable skill. Their combined force was enormous, hundreds of ships carrying tens of thousands of soldiers, siege engineers, and supplies. In October, the campaign began. The sea route and the land route moved like two arms of a single body, meant to converge upon the heart of Đại Việt, the Red River Plain and its capital, Thonglong, modern Hanoi. The fleet entered the Gulf of Bac Bo, present-day Gulf of Tonkin, and set course toward the mouth of the Bac Dang River, near modern Quang Ninh province. The land army, under Togon, advanced through the high mountain passes of Lang Son and Cao Bang, descending through valleys choked with mist and rain. The Yuan commanders had studied their previous failures. They carried more supplies, reinforced their lines of communication, and employed local guides. Yet despite these precautions, the seeds of disaster were already sown. The sheer scale of the operation meant that the logistics were fragile. Each soldier consumed rice and grain that had to be transported across mountains or shipped by sea. The slightest disruption, a storm, a delayed convoy, could cripple the entire campaign. The first blow came not from swords, but from wind and water. As Omar's fleet rounded the coast toward Ha Long Bay, it encountered the unpredictable weather of the northern seas. Sudden squalls scattered the formation. Some ships ran aground on hidden reefs. Others were driven back toward the coast of Guangxi. The admiral pressed onward, regrouping near the mouth of the Bac Dang, but the fleet had already lost precious supplies and time. On land, Togon's army faced the same invisible enemies that had plagued them before: rain, hunger, and exhaustion. The steep passes of Nam Quan were choked with mud. Horses slipped, supply carts overturned, and the jungle seemed to swallow men whole. By the time the Yuan forces reached the frontier, they had already burned through a large portion of their provisions. In Thonglong, the court of Emperor Trần Nhân Tông received word of the approaching armies with grim calm. The lessons of past wars had been carefully preserved. This time, Đại Việt would not merely resist, it would prepare the battlefield itself. Along the Bakdang River, where the tide rose and fell with deadly precision, the Trun commanders planned a trap unlike any other. Trun Kindu, a brilliant but unconventional general known for his cunning, was entrusted with leading the naval defense. He understood that the sea would be both their greatest risk and their greatest ally. Under his command, craftsmen worked in secret to sharpen thousands of iron-tipped stakes and embed them deep into the riverbed. These stakes, invisible at high tide, would become a deadly forest of spears when the water receded. Above them, the river flowed calmly, betraying nothing. Further upstream, Trun Hungdao coordinated the grand strategy. Scouts shadowed the enemy fleet, tracking its movements. Messengers raced between the coastal provinces and the capital. Every village, every fisherman, knew his role. The land was a living map of resistance. As the Yuan fleet approached the Bakdang, the air grew heavy with anticipation. Fishermen reported seeing dark silhouettes of ships massing offshore, enormous vessels with sails like black wings. The sound of drums echoed faintly across the waves. The river, swollen by the tide, appeared tranquil, but beneath its surface, the sharpened stakes waited like the teeth of a dragon. On a foggy morning in early winter, the first skirmishes began. Small Vietnamese boats darted from the inlets, firing arrows and flaming projectiles, then retreating into the mist. The Yuan sailors, thinking they faced only scattered resistance, pursued recklessly. Omar ordered a full advance into the river's mouth, his voice echoing over the water. The hulls of his ships sliced through the current, unaware that each meter brought them deeper into the trap. To the west, Togon's land army was equally overextended. Marching south toward Thanglang, he received messages that the fleet would rendezvous with him within weeks. Confident, he pressed forward, occupying empty villages and looted fields. But the emptiness was an illusion. Behind the hills, Trun Hungdao's forces shadowed him, striking at stragglers, cutting off supply wagons, and vanishing before retaliation. The empty field strategy once again bled the invaders dry without a single pitched battle. By December, the Yuan campaign was already showing cracks. Food shortages spread. Soldiers scavenged fruit and bark to survive. Letters from Omar to Togon grew increasingly desperate, begging for coordination and resupply. Togon's messengers often never arrived, ambushed or drowned in swollen rivers. The unity of the invasion began to crumble. Then came the psychological toll. Veterans remembered the disasters of the previous invasion. Younger soldiers began to whisper that the land itself was cursed. Fever stalked the camps, horses died from rot in their hooves, ships leaked from swollen timbers. And always there was the sound, the ceaseless rain tapping on armor, the rhythmic slap of waves against hulls, like the slow counting of time. By the turn of the year 1288, the stage was set. The Mongol armies had reached deeper into Đại Việt than ever before, yet they were stretched to their limit. The Vietnamese forces, scattered but coordinated, had allowed them to advance deliberately, leading them exactly where they wanted them to be. On the riverbanks, soldiers waited in silence as the tide rose, covering the wooden stakes beneath the murky water. The air was thick with the scent of salt and smoke. In the distance, the silhouettes of Yuan ships loomed larger, their torches flickering like restless spirits. As night fell, a faint wind carried the sound of drums, not from the invaders, but from the defenders. The rhythmic beat traveled along the river, from one hidden outpost to another, signaling that the trap was ready. From his command post near the Bakdang estuary, Trun Kindu watched the horizon. His armor was wet from spray, his face streaked with sweat and rain. He could see the enemy fleet moving slowly inland, like a black tide creeping toward the shore. Behind him, his men waited, oars resting across their knees, torches ready to ignite the fireboats. "Let them come," he said quietly, his eyes never leaving the horizon. "The river remembers." The soldiers nodded, gripping their weapons. The water around them rippled softly, concealing the forest of iron below. In the darkness, the tide began to turn, the current shifting, the river drawing back toward the sea. The tops of the sharpened stakes started to glisten faintly in the moonlight. And so the stage was set for one of the most brilliant ambushes in Vietnamese history. The Mongols, weary and starving, unaware of what awaited beneath the river's surface, would sail straight into the jaws of defeat. Their goal was clear: to seize Thonglong once more and install Trun Ik Tak, the traitor prince, as puppet king. But fate and the river had other designs. The empire that had conquered the world now faced the cunning of a small nation that had turned its land and waters into living weapons. The final tempest had arrived, a storm not of nature but of vengeance, patience, and unyielding will. The night was calm, but beneath the surface, the river waited to roar. The dawn of the 9th day of the 4th month in the year 1288 rose pale and cold over the Bakdang River, near what is today Quang Province. The tide was high, its surface calm, concealing beneath it a forest of sharpened stakes driven deep into the riverbed, each one tipped with iron and soaked in secrecy. Mist hung over the water like a shroud. Somewhere beyond it, the Mongol Yuan fleet advanced, oars slicing through the current, unaware that they were sailing toward their doom. For months, the invaders had struggled to sustain themselves in a land that refused to yield. Their supply lines had collapsed, their soldiers were starving, and their fleet, once the pride of the empire, was desperate to retreat north with whatever honor remained. But Trun Hung Dao, the grand commander of Đại Việt, knew the rhythm of the river as one knows the beat of a heart. He had waited for this moment, when the tide and the enemy would rise together. At dawn, he stood upon the deck of his command vessel, the wind tugging at his banner embroidered with the golden dragon of the Trun dynasty. Around him, the mist swirled in ghostly spirals. He closed his eyes briefly, listening to the creak of the boats, the faint rush of water, the muffled breathing of the men. Then he raised his hand, and the drums began to sound, slow, deliberate, like the pulse of the earth. From the north, the Mongol fleet under Admiral Omar appeared through the fog, their dark hulls cutting across the river's surface. Zhang Wenhu's supply ships followed close behind, laden with the remnants of provisions and treasure. The Yuan soldiers shouted orders in multiple tongues, Mongolian, Chinese, Persian, their voices echoing strangely in the still air. They had been told this passage was their escape route, the only way home. But as they sailed deeper into the river, the fog began to clear, revealing the narrowing channel. The riverbanks on both sides were silent, too silent. Then came the first volley. From the concealed coves and inlets, Vietnamese warboats erupted into view, their sails painted dark to blend with the mist. Fire arrows streaked through the sky, trailing smoke. Flaming oil pots arced downward, striking the decks of the enemy ships. The Mongols, startled, scrambled to form ranks, but the tide was turning. The water began to recede, slowly at first, then rapidly. The hidden stakes beneath the surface began to emerge like the teeth of a monstrous jaw. The first of the Yuan ships struck them head-on. The impact splintered the hulls with a crack like thunder. Water poured in, men screamed as they were thrown overboard. The current carried them toward the other stakes, where jagged iron met flesh. Trun Hung Dao's timing was flawless. He had ordered his men to lure the enemy into the river at high tide, feigning retreat, and then to strike when the tide reversed. The Mongol fleet, caught in the narrowing channel, found itself trapped, unable to maneuver, unable to flee. The deeper ships ran aground, while those behind collided with them, turning the once orderly formation into chaos. On the riverbanks, Vietnamese archers loosed their arrows in waves, their cries echoing across the valley. Satat! Kill the Tartars! The sound was like thunder rolling down from the mountains. Fireboats, loaded with straw and pitch, drifted with the outgoing tide, striking the immobilized Yuan ships and setting them ablaze. Omar, the admiral who had once commanded with pride, tried desperately to rally his men. Standing on the deck of his flagship, he shouted orders to turn the fleet, but the current betrayed him. The oarsmen rowed furiously, their muscles straining, but the river was no longer theirs to command. The stakes tore through the hulls. Water rushed in. A sudden explosion of fire lit the sky as one of the great ships went up in flames, its mast collapsing into the inferno. Pham Ngu Lao led the boarding parties. His men leapt from their warboats onto the crippled enemy vessels, cutting through panicked soldiers who slipped and fell on blood-slicked decks. The screams of drowning men mixed with the roar of the flames and the clash of steel. Amid the carnage, Trần Quang Khai's division sealed the river's mouth, ensuring no ship could escape to the open sea. By midday, the battle was a massacre. The river boiled with wreckage and bodies. The air was thick with smoke and ash. Sunlight turned the water crimson. According to Wikipedia and the Vietnamese Đại Việt Su Ki Tuan Thu, more than 400 enemy ships were destroyed or captured. Tens of thousands of Yuan soldiers perished, drowned, burned, or slain. Admiral Omar himself was killed in the chaos, his body lost to the river that had betrayed him. Trần Hưng Đạo stood at the prow of his vessel, watching as the tide receded further, exposing the deadly forest of stakes now glistening with iron and blood. Around him, his soldiers cheered, their voices hoarse but triumphant. He raised his sword high, the blade catching the light like a shard of the sun. "The river has chosen," he said quietly. When the last of the enemy resistance collapsed, the Vietnamese forces began to salvage what they could: ships, armor, weapons, and the bodies of the fallen. Prisoners were taken, including remnants of Zhang Wenhu's command. The admiral himself escaped north with only a handful of ships, his once mighty fleet reduced to splinters and corpses. That evening, as the fires burned low and the smoke drifted out to sea, the soldiers gathered on the riverbanks. The victory had been absolute, but the sight before them was terrible. The river that had fed their crops and carried their songs now flowed thick with ash and blood. The stench of war clung to the air, mingled with the salt of the tide. Trần Hưng Đạo walked among his men, speaking softly to each group. "You have done what our ancestors dreamed," he told them. "You have made the name of Đại Việt shine upon the waters." When he reached the wounded, he knelt beside them, his hands still stained from battle. To one dying soldier who tried to rise and salute, he said, "Rest, brother. The river will carry your honor home." In Thăng Long, the bells of the temples rang out before the messengers even arrived. The people sensed victory. By the time the official reports reached the capital, the city had already begun to celebrate. Torches lined the streets. Incense filled the air. The emperor, Trần Nhân Tông, wept openly when he received word of the triumph. He ordered that the temples throughout the land hold 7 days of prayer in gratitude to heaven and to the spirits of the fallen. The victory at Bac Dang was not merely a military success, it was the culmination of a century of defiance. Once again, the invincible Mongol Empire, conqueror of China, Persia, and the steppes, had been humbled by a small nation that refused to yield. Never again would the Yuan attempt to invade Đại Việt. The dream of subjugating the south had drowned in the same waters that had once carried the invaders' ships. Chroniclers described the battle with reverence and awe. They wrote of the river as a living force, of the stakes as the teeth of dragons, of the flames as the wrath of heaven itself. Later generations would speak the name Bac Dang as both a prayer and a warning, the place where invaders were swallowed by the sea. As the smoke cleared, the evening sun set behind the mangrove-lined banks, casting the river in a deep crimson glow. The surviving soldiers stood silently, watching the tide rise again and cover the stakes, as though the river wished to erase the memory of violence and return to peace. But history would not forget. That day, Đại Việt emerged not only victorious, but immortal. The Mongol Empire had learned that there was one frontier it could not conquer: the heart of a people who fought with the patience of the tide and the fury of the storm. And in the gathering dusk, as the last fires flickered upon the water, Trần Hưng Đạo looked out over the river that had carried his destiny. His voice, low but steady, carried on the wind. "The land endures, the river endures, and so shall we." By the end of the third month of the year, 1288, the Mongol banners that had once cast their shadow over the Red River Delta vanished into the northern mist. The mightiest empire on earth was in retreat, not triumphant, not orderly, but broken and humiliated. The final remnants of Togon's army stumbled northward through the mountain passes of Lang Son and Cao Bang, a procession of exhaustion and despair. The path that had once glittered with the promise of conquest was now littered with wreckage. Abandoned wagons, skeletal horses, and discarded armor marked the road home. The survivors marched in silence, their faces hollow with hunger and disease. Those who could not keep pace were left behind, their bodies claimed by the jungle. What had begun as a campaign of glory ended as a funeral march through the rain. The chronicles describe the retreat as a chaos of misery. The army that had once entered Đại Việt in disciplined columns now fragmented into desperate bands, pursued at every turn by guerrilla forces. Arrows hissed from the shadows, traps snapped shut beneath the undergrowth, and the rivers, swollen by spring rains, devoured those too weak to cross. Togon himself narrowly escaped capture, disguised among his bodyguards, riding without rest until he reached the safety of the frontier. The prince who had once dreamed of wearing a conqueror's crown now returned to Beijing in silence, his pride drowned in the waters of Bakdang. Back in the north, Kublai Khan received the news with grim composure. Reports from the field were vague and evasive, filled with words like unfavorable weather and intractable terrain. But the truth was undeniable. The third invasion had failed as utterly as the two before it. The emperor's fury gave way to resignation. He had spent vast fortunes and countless lives for nothing. The southern jungles had consumed 3 generations of his soldiers. The great conqueror turned his gaze elsewhere, toward administration, diplomacy, and the more pliant kingdoms that preferred tribute to rebellion. Đại would no longer be taken by force. For the Trần dynasty, the victory was total, yet the kingdom they reclaimed was scarred. When the last of the Yuan troops withdrew, they left behind not cities in flames, but a land hollowed by exhaustion. The rice paddies lay fallow, their dikes broken, irrigation canals clogged with silt, villages half empty, their thatched roofs blackened by fire. Along the roadside stood the charred remains of watchtowers and bridges. When the royal army re-entered Thanglang, the capital was silent, but not dead. The people emerged slowly from hiding, farmers, monks, fishermen, children clutching their mothers' robes. Their faces bore the marks of hardship, but their eyes were bright with relief. Emperor Trần, riding at the head of his procession, dismounted before the palace gate and knelt upon the ground. He pressed his hands to the earth and whispered a prayer. This soil has endured the storm. May it never again taste such suffering. Within days, the city came alive again. Drums of victory echoed from the citadel walls. The emperor issued proclamations of clemency. No retribution for collaborators who repented. No punishment for those who had fled in fear. The war is over, he declared. Now we must heal. The reconstruction began almost immediately. The surviving soldiers were sent to help rebuild villages and repair dikes. Craftsmen restored the royal citadel's gates. Monks organized communal kitchens for the displaced. The sound of hammers replaced that of swords. From Wikipedia and contemporary Vietnamese annals, historians describe this as a time of both mourning and rebirth. The kingdom's fields, once trampled by war, were replanted. Laborers dredged the irrigation canals and raised the banks of the Red River. New granaries were built along the floodplain. The emperor personally visited the countryside, walking barefoot through the muddy fields to encourage the farmers. If we wish to endure, he told them, we must sow again where we bled. Trần Hưng oversaw the restoration of the military, but his orders were clear, not to prepare for another war, but to fortify peace. He reorganized the army into smaller regional units that could defend without draining the nation's strength. The Navy, now legendary for its triumph at Bac Dung, was tasked with patrolling the coastal waters and protecting merchants. For the first time in decades, trade ships from Champa and Siam began to return to the harbors of Đại Việt, their sails white against the blue horizon. In the countryside, the wounds of war healed slowly. Fields that had lain empty for years began to turn green again. The smell of wet soil returned to the air. Families rebuilt their homes from the ashes, and children played where battles had once raged. Temples held ceremonies for the souls of the dead, their chants drifting over the rivers that had carried so much sorrow. The emperor also moved swiftly to secure the loyalty of his people. He honored veterans with land and titles, ensuring their families would never go hungry. To the widows and orphans, he granted stipends of rice. The kingdom's poets and scholars were invited to record the deeds of the war, not merely the victories, but the sacrifices. These chronicles, preserved for generations, became both history and hymn. From the north, the Yuan court's response was subdued. Kublai Khan, wearied by age and failure, abandoned plans for further conquest. Instead, he reinstated the old tributary system, accepting symbolic embassies and gifts from Đại Việt as gestures of respect. In return, he recognized the Trần dynasty's sovereignty. The war that had begun with fire and blood ended in a fragile peace sealed by ceremony and words. No Mongol army would ever again march into Vietnamese soil. The empire that had conquered continents had found its limit, not in might, but in endurance. As years passed, the the scars of invasion faded into legend. The name Bakdang became a sacred symbol, the river immortalized in poems and songs. The people spoke of it with reverence, as though it were a living guardian that had defended them. In the twilight of his life, Trunhung remained the kingdom's steadfast guardian. Though his hair had turned white and his hands bore the tremors of age, his presence still commanded awe. From his residence near the northern hills, he would sometimes ride to the banks of the Red River and gaze at the water flowing eastward. The soldiers who accompanied him said that he never spoke much during these visits, but his eyes, once sharp with fire, now softened with pride and melancholy. He had seen more war than any man should. He had led armies through blood and smoke, had watched men die by the thousands, and had carried the burden of command heavier than any crown. Yet now, in the peace that followed, he saw something greater than victory. He saw endurance. When asked by a young officer what victory meant after so much loss, the old general smiled faintly. "Victory," he said, "is not when the enemy falls, but when your people rise again." His words became part of the national memory, inscribed in stone and song. By the time of his death, the rivers of Đại Việt had returned to calm, their waters carrying the reflection of a land reborn. The Trần dynasty would endure for generations more, its golden age defined not by conquest, but by the strength to survive what no empire could break. And as evening fell upon Thăng Long, the lamps of the capital flickered against the mist, soft, steady, and unyielding, like the spirit of the nation itself. From the ashes of invasion, Đại Việt had not merely survived, it had stood tall, unbroken, and eternal. When the fires of war at last faded into memory, the land of Đại Việt stood transformed, scarred but unconquered, weary but free. 3 times the Mongol Empire, the greatest war machine in human history, had descended upon it with all the thunder of conquest. 3 times it had been repelled. What remained after such trials was not only a kingdom intact, but a spirit burnished into legend. From the chronicles preserved in temples and the accounts of foreign travelers, Lich Su Tuan Ko and other histories tell the same astonishing truth. Đại Việt did not fall, did not bend, and did not become a shadow of its conqueror. The Trần dynasty endured, ruling for another century, guiding its people through recovery and renewal. In the midst of empires that rose and fell like storms, this small nation became a fixed star, a symbol of persistence against overwhelming odds. The Mongols, who had swept across the plains of Eurasia from the Danube to the Pacific, discovered in the humid valleys of Southeast Asia the limits of their empire. The campaigns against Đại Việt exposed not merely a strategic failure, but a philosophical one. The assumption that force could subdue any land, that fear could command obedience. The jungles, the rivers, the monsoon itself had conspired with a people who refused to yield. Strategically, the Yuan generals learned harsh lessons. Their horses, so swift and deadly on the steppe, were rendered useless in the quagmire of rain-soaked fields. Their heavy armor rusted, their bows warped, and their men withered under the relentless climate. Supply lines stretched thin and broke. Their elaborate formations collapsed into chaos in terrain that defied control. Logistics, more than battle, had undone them. The Mongols, who once thought themselves masters of the world, came to understand that even the greatest empire has boundaries, not drawn by maps, but by nature and the will of those who defend their home. For Đại Việt, these wars became the crucible in which its national identity was forged. The victories of the Trần dynasty were not merely military, they were existential affirmations of sovereignty. The kings, generals, and common folk alike had proven that a nation's survival rests not on size or wealth, but on unity. When the Mongols demanded surrender, the answer came not from a throne alone, but from an entire people who rose in one voice. In the annals of warfare, the campaigns of Đại Việt stand as rare examples of a small country defeating a superpower through intelligence, adaptation, and resilience. The lessons were manifold. Militarily, the Trần commanders revolutionized the art of defensive warfare. They turned geography into weaponry, the rivers, forests, and tides into living allies. The strategy of empty fields, hollow houses was not simply retreat but psychological warfare, starving the enemy without a battle, stretching their resolve until it broke. The use of guerrilla tactics, coordinated with conventional forces, foreshadowed principles of resistance that would later echo across centuries of Vietnamese history. The naval strategies employed on the Bakdang River remain a masterpiece of ingenuity. Few other battles in world history demonstrate such perfect synchronization of terrain, timing, and tide. The hidden stakes beneath the water, the feigned retreats, the precise calculation of currents, all revealed a genius born of necessity. Generals and historians alike would later study it as an exemplar of how intellect could triumph over overwhelming might. Beyond the battlefield, the wars left a profound imprint on the nation's soul. Out of blood and fire arose a culture bound by gratitude and remembrance. Temples dedicated to Trun Hung Dao, the Grand Commander of the Rivers, were erected along the northern coasts. Incense burns there even now, centuries later, curling upward like the smoke that once rose from the burning fleets of Bakdang. His name became not just that of a general, but of a guardian spirit, invoked in times of peril and crisis. Poets and chroniclers of later generations transformed these wars into living myth. Songs of the Red River and the heroism of the Trun warriors passed through generations as lullabies and lessons alike. The image of the river that swallowed empires became a metaphor for endurance. Calm on the surface, deadly beneath. Every child who recited the story of Bakdang learned that courage is not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. The cultural legacy extended far beyond the military. The Trun victories instilled a philosophy of balance between humility and pride, diplomacy and defense. The emperors who followed maintained tribute relations with China not as submission, but as a form of strategic grace, acknowledging power without surrendering sovereignty. This delicate balance between resistance and diplomacy would become a defining feature of Vietnamese statecraft for centuries to come. Even for the Mongols, the wars left echoes. They had encountered not only a foe, but a teacher. In the imperial court at Beijing, scholars analyzed the defeats with candor. They noted the impossibility of sustaining large armies in tropical climates, the futility of relying on speed in flooded terrain, and the moral cost of waging endless war against peoples whose strength lay in endurance rather than expansion. The campaigns against Đại Việt, Champa, and Java taught them what maps could not, that conquest has natural limits. To later historians, the struggle between Đại Việt and the Yuan Empire stands as one of the most remarkable asymmetries of power in world history. A confrontation between the colossal and the small, between iron and water, between the arrogance of empire and the quiet defiance of identity. And in that confrontation, the smaller side prevailed. As centuries passed, the story of the Trun dynasty's resistance became both shield and mirror for future generations. Whenever foreign threats loomed, the nation remembered the lesson of those years, that courage, patience, and unity could withstand even the most powerful of invaders. The names of the heroes, Trun Hung Dao, Trun Quang Kai, Pham Ngu Lao, became immortal, invoked not as relics of the past, but as living symbols of what the people could achieve when their freedom was at stake. The spirit of those victories lived on not just in chronicles, but in the rhythm of daily life. Fishermen along the northern rivers still sang of the stakes beneath the tide. Farmers in the Red River Delta still told their children how their ancestors had turned the land itself into a shield. Each generation, facing its own storms, found solace in the memory that their forebears had once faced the greatest storm of all, and prevailed. And so the legacy of the Mongol Wars was not destruction, but definition. Đại Việt had proven that size was not destiny, that geography could be transformed into strength, and that unity could make a small nation unconquerable. Standing between great powers, China to the north, the kingdoms of the south and west beyond the mountains, Đại Việt learned to survive by its wits, its discipline, and its pride. It neither sought conquest nor accepted submission. Its victories were not for expansion, but for existence. In the quiet years that followed, when peace returned to the Red River Plain, the monks of Thang Long carved a simple phrase upon the stone walls of a temple rebuilt from the ashes of war. A small country can be great when its heart is greater than its fear. That sentence, worn by centuries of rain and moss, still glimmers faintly today. And so ends the story of the small kingdom that made the empire tremble. A story not merely of battles and kings, but of endurance, wisdom, and faith in one truth. Though the world may see a nation as small, it need not be weak. Though its armies may be few, its spirit, if steadfast, can shake the earth. For Đại Việt had shown, once and forever, that greatness is not measured by the reach of empire, but by the depth of the heart that dares to stand against it.